What's up guys, Nick True here, and today I'm going to answer a question that I get all the time from my 20-something friends. How much money do we need to be saving inside that emergency fund? Well, surprise, surprise, the answer is totally different for you than it is for your parents, because who knew that being young in 2017 is totally different than being middle-aged in 2017? So some of the normal things that get thrown around, the words of advice, may or may not work for your situation. That's why I'm going to walk you step by step through the questions that you need to answer to figure out how much money you need to be putting in that emergency fund. So the typical rule of thumb that you're going to hear from a lot of personal finance experts is you need to be saving 3 to 6 months of living expenses in a separate emergency fund account. But you may not understand where that number comes from. And the main reason that 3 to 6 months gets thrown around is because on average the unemployment rate is roughly 3 months. And so the main reason you've got this emergency fund is to hedge against job loss. The problem is that this advice, while it means well, is not always the best answer for people in their 20s. For starters, getting 3 to 6 months of living expenses can seem so massively unattainable that you don't even want to try saving in the first place. People in their 20s are facing massive amounts of student loan debt, plus a lower income than they will likely have later on in life. Plus, this is the first time they're really getting out on their own, getting away from mom and dad and dealing with all that entails, and not to mention the fact that they're going to be tempted to go out on weekends and hang out with their friends and travel while they don't have kids and a family, so they can do that stuff now. Although we face a lot of negatives when it comes to saving, we also have a lot of advantages right now that we're not going to have later on in our life. In your 20s, you can afford to live a little cheaper and more uncomfortable now because you're probably used to it from college. You've got a lot more time on your hands to pick up a second job because you're not taking care of a family. Your expenses are likely lower even if you've got student loans because you don't have a house to fix all the time and you don't have any kids to pay for. Not to mention the fact that when you're in your 20s, your job stability is probably a little bit better. The fact is that when you're young, you can afford to take a little more risk in order to gain positive upside in the long run. I just mean that you can go a little light on your emergency fund in order to put a little extra towards debt or investing for your future. All that being said, how much money do I think that you need to have in that emergency fund? Well, the first thing you need to do is get just $1,000. Now, why is getting to $1,000 so important? Well, it does two things. Number one is that most kind of random emergencies that are going to come up are probably going to be under that $1,000, and this will allow you to take care of a car breakdown or something kind of odd and off the wall without going into debt to do it. The second reason that this is important is purely psychological. When you go from living paycheck to paycheck and basically using all the money up in your checking account every single month to all of a sudden you've got $1,000 in savings as an emergency, you just feel so much better, and you're more likely to actually go on and hit your long-term goals because you've already proven to yourself that you can set a goal of hitting $1,000 and then getting there. Make sure you're paying whatever minimum payments you need to be making on your loans, but before you do anything else and save any more or pay any more, you need to get to that $1,000 emergency fund as soon as possible. So once you've hit that $1,000, what do you do next? How much money should you really be aiming for? Should you then aim for 3 to 6 months of living expenses? Should you pay off your debt and then kind of also aim for 3 to 6 months? Like, how do you think you should go about that? Well, if you paid any attention to what I talk about on this channel or what I believe in, I'm a big believer that personal finance is personal, which means what works for you may or may not work for anybody else. You need to figure out what works for your specific situation. I'm not big on giving blanket advice that's just supposed to fit the masses. Instead, I want you to figure out what's going to work for you. Depending on your comfort level, you can either do one of two things when it comes to the next step with your emergency fund. The first group is for people who have a relatively stable job, could find another job relatively easily, or they've got a large enough income that they could drastically lower their monthly expenses and things would be okay. These people have a large enough income to where they're living in a nicer apartment than really what they could, or they don't have any roommates and they could just add a couple, or they're spending a lot more on groceries and food than they really should. They could easily downsize apartments, add a roommate, or start eating a lot of ramen noodles and drastically lower their expenses pretty easily. What I would say to these people is that get that $1,000 emergency fund and then immediately start taking any excess savings you have and just attacking any student loan or any other debt that you've got. You're young, you likely don't have a family, you can take the risk of only having that $1,000 emergency fund in order to pay down that debt super duper fast. And in the long run, that's going to help you a whole lot more. Now, what about that second group? If you feel like your job is relatively unstable, or that if you did lose your job, it would be pretty difficult for you to find another one, or your monthly expenses compared to your monthly income is already pretty darn tight, then I would be hesitant to start totally throwing a ton of money at your debt with only $1,000 as an emergency fund. For this group, I would say that you need to try and save up 1 or 2 months worth of living expenses. The problem is that if you lose your job and it's going to take you a while to go and find another one, you're going to find yourself in a situation where you're going to need to go use credit cards or some other type of loan just to live. And all the money that you were throwing at the student loan debt or the car loan debt that you could have been putting into a savings account is all going to go to waste because these new loans that you now have to have just to live probably probably have a higher interest rate than the student loans that you were paying on early. If you're already in a little bit of a more risky situation because of your job or because of your normal living expenses, then you might want to go ahead and save up 1 to 2 months worth of an emergency fund first. Now, to be fair, there are people in this group that should go ahead and save up more than $1,000, even though they may look like the people in this group, and that's because they're just inherently a less risky person. If you're not going to sleep well at night because you've only got $1,000 in the bank and it's just going to stress you out to not have a little bit bigger of an emergency fund, that's fine. That works for you. Go ahead and join group number 2 and save up a little bit more before you start throwing massive amounts of money at the student loans. The big idea with saving for an emergency fund in your 20s is that yes, the long-term goal should be to have 6 months worth of living expenses saved up. But if you've got any kind of debt other than a home mortgage, you're probably better off throwing a bunch of money at that debt rather than trying to save up on an emergency fund on an already low income. You can afford to have a little smaller emergency fund when you're in 20s because you don't have a whole family with kids and everything relying on you and your income. If all hell breaks loose, you can rough it. You can move back into an apartment with 4 roommates and eat ramen noodles and chicken nuggets for the next 2 years while you get back on your feet. It's not that big a deal. So take advantage of this time to destroy any debt that you have and really start investing now for your future. Remember, the more time that your money has to take advantage of compound interest over the years, the more money you're going to have later on in life. Now, before you go, I have 2 more quick little notes on the whole loan versus saving an emergency fund thing. If the loans you have are small enough to just really attack them and totally knock them out within the next year, year and a half, then you definitely can afford to keep that $1,000 emergency fund while you just attack those loans. But if you're one of the sad folks who got themselves into a situation where you've got like $100,000 worth of student loans and you're only making $50,000 a year, that may not be the best advice for you. Problem is, it's going to take you a long time to pay that debt off because basic math says that if you're only making half of what you got in student loans, then that's a problem. In this case, I would save up at least a couple months worth of emergency money instead of just that $1,000, because over the course of the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 years that it's going to take you to pay that off, you're going to get hit with an emergency that's considerably larger than $1,000. That's just kind of how life goes. So if that's you, then you're definitely in group number 2 over here, and you probably want to save up a few months worth of living expenses instead of just $1,000 that group number 1 would be okay with. The bottom line is that when you're setting up your own emergency fund goal, there is not one hard and fast rule that fits everybody, and you need to figure out what works for your specific situation. So that's it, guys. Now, if you like this video, be sure to hit the subscribe button below, and remember, I can teach you how to be smart and save your emergency money, but I can't make you do it. The choice is yours. I'll see y'all next time.